I'm Edward Warfield. I'm the publisher of Citybiz, and I'm honored today to interview Laura Neuman, who is a gubernatorial candidate for the governor of Maryland. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here today.
So, Laura, your childhood experiences go beyond the Detroit rags to riches. You have an incredibly compelling story. Can you walk us through some of the key milestones from your childhood, your educational attainment, and your entrepreneurial experiences?
Sure, of course. Thank you. I am not a child who grew up thinking I would ever run for governor of Maryland. I didn't know those kinds of opportunities were available when I was a child. I started in inner city Baltimore off of Orleans Street, and my parents were both high school dropouts and both had been arrested multiple times. It was also a very abusive home, and my parents struggled a lot. So for me, I'd always heard that education growing up was the pathway to success, but that wasn't something that we talked about a lot in my house. So my goal was really to move out and go pursue that on my own. Unfortunately, I ended up dropping out of high school just like my parents. And instead of staying home, I chose to live in my car. So I put all of my belongings into a trash bag and I moved into my car, which was an 8-year-old Pontiac at the time. And I chose that over being at home. And the goal in living in the car was really to save enough money so that I could afford the down payment on an apartment, and which I did. It took about 6 months. And then I moved into my apartment. And 2 weeks later, after moving in, unfortunately, I was home alone and I was raped. I called the police because that's what you're supposed to do when you're in need in the community. And the police came and they very quickly let me know that they didn't believe me. I had been raped at gunpoint, and they walked me through how they thought I had staged the whole crime, including taking a shoe out of my closet and putting it up against the shoe print underneath the window where the perpetrators had come in. So they went to that level of detail in trying to, convince other people and get me to change my story about whether or not it had been staged. Of course, I didn't change my story because it really happened, but the end result is that they didn't believe me, my parents didn't believe me, and the case was never investigated. And it was from there that I really had to go forward and figure out what I would do with my life and who I would be in the world. And that was not easy to do. I didn't feel prepared, and I certainly didn't have any support in that effort. I was waiting tables and working in retail. And then one day, I replied to a help wanted ad for a company I'd never heard of course, because I hadn't been exposed to such things. The name of the company was T. Rowe Price, and I became a part-time customer service rep. They were reluctant at first to hire me because I didn't have a college degree, and that was one of their requirements. But they took a chance and let me become a part-time employee there. They did say to me, you don't qualify for benefits because you're not being hired as a full-time employee. And I said, that's okay, because I didn't know what benefits were at the time. So I had a lot to learn. And throughout my 20s, I worked at different companies, trying to work my way up. I really wanted to make my career in business. I liked it right away, and I felt it was a good fit for me. But of course, I couldn't afford to go to college. So that created a ceiling over and over again. Every time I went to another company, I'd work hard and I'd do well, but I was never on a track for opportunity because of the lack of education. And that was extremely frustrating. I applied to a lot of big companies, IBM, Microsoft, Apple, and over again, that kept me from moving forward. When I was in my early 30s, I was working in a direct mail company, and a school came in for a direct mail campaign. And I always dressed like I worked in a bank, even though I worked at a direct mail company, because I took it very seriously. I wanted to prove myself. And when Loyola came in and asked for the direct mail campaign, of course, I conducted the meeting, and they called me afterwards and said, we'd like you to consider applying to our MBA program because we think you'd be a good candidate. And I was beyond flattered. I mean, the idea that they saw that as potential in me was really extraordinary. But I was also very embarrassed because obviously they thought I had gone to college. So I had to call them and explain that, in fact, I probably didn't qualify. But instead of just calling, I decided to go in and meet with them. I requested a meeting and I met with them and said, look, this is my story. This is where I started and this is where I got off track. And I asked them if they would consider making an exception. And ultimately, they agreed to make an exception. And that's how I got a master's degree in business without finishing high school or college. That was a game changer for me. I mean, Loyola took a chance on me. And it was around that time that I started my career as a technology entrepreneur. When I was trying to create opportunity in business and I couldn't get others to see that potential in me, I thought, well, I'll prove myself. I'll bet on myself and prove that I can do it. And I ended up becoming CEO of a technology company started by two scientists out of NSA. I raised venture capital for that company and turned it around. It was very successful. And by the way, as a business person, there's a lot of risk associated with success. And I took the risk. I cashed in all my savings. I cashed in my retirement account and I paid my mortgage on a credit card because this company didn't have enough money to pay me. So I did it in exchange for equity and built the company, learned how to raise. I never raised venture capital, of course. So I learned how to do that, turned the company around, and it was eventually sold for $230 million. So I had negotiated a strong equity position because they couldn't afford to pay me a salary. And when the company was sold, it was a win for everyone, including me. And that was really just not only was it a life changer for me, but I had bet on myself and I felt good about that because ultimately it led to success. And after that, I went back and had I request. I was in a different place in my life, truthfully. And I went back to the Baltimore City Police Department. And I decided to take the same techniques I learned in business and apply them to my personal life. And I decided I would call them every day until they decided to investigate my case. And they did. So that technique works great in sales if you're in business, but it also worked for me personally because I called so many times that I finally found the right person. He took on my case. And after 19 years, my rape case was solved in 3 days. So they arrested the guy. He went to jail. And a couple years later, it turned out my decision to be an advocate for rape victims and sexual assault led to connecting him to many more cases in Baltimore County. And so I did a show on 48 Hours, and that show was the connection between my case in Baltimore City and the dozens of cases in Baltimore County that he was also guilty of. And so we found out he was the worst serial offender in Maryland history. And I testified in Annapolis on legislation, and I remain an advocate in that area because it's a personal project for me. I made a commitment the night before he was arrested that I would do everything I could for the rest of my life to help other women. So that's my personal mission. And then in my career, I'd done very well as a tech entrepreneur, and I loved that. And I still love working with entrepreneurs. But I really wanted to also make a difference in the public sector. So I decided to go into public service. My first position was in Howard County, running economic development. I had the honor of working with Ken Ullman there, and he's just such an innovative, smart thinker. And he was willing to rethink economic development, which is why it was such a joy to work there. And after that, ended up becoming county executive of Anne Arundel County, my home county. And that was truly an honor to serve the community. So it's been quite a career, a combination of public and private with a bit of advocacy thrown in as well.
You recently visited your childhood home, and that really had an impact on your decision to run for governor. Tell us about that visit.
I never planned to run again. I mean, I loved public service. It was really an honor to serve my community, but the politics of it wasn't really something that I enjoyed. And so I thought, there are a lot of ways to serve. And so I'll focus on that. So, for example, I just was the chair of the Baltimore Child Abuse Center's annual fund, now called the Center for Hope. They're helping the most underprivileged in our community. That's a way to serve, and that's meaningful to me. But I was asked to go back to my childhood home to be interviewed for a documentary on my advocacy work for women. And while I was there being interviewed, the boy who lives in the house now came out to watch what we were doing. So, I'm a mom, and when a child is sitting in front of me, of course, I want to talk to them. So I started talking to him, and I realized that he's about the same age as I was when I lived there. And what really struck me as I talked to him is that, what's different between when I lived in that house decades ago and now? Not much has changed. His school system is not supporting him. His public safety outcome is not great. His health outcome is not great. And I was really struck that not much has changed over the decades. And that's not acceptable to me. I know I can make a difference. And so I think if you know you can, you should. And I called the person doing the documentary afterwards, and I was like, I can't stop thinking about that boy. And that was really the beginning of making the decision to run again, because I don't think it's acceptable to have status quo, and we need to make government work for the people of our state.
So you're the ninth candidate to join the 2022 race for the Democratic nomination. What were your motivations and sort of the rationale to enter a hyper-competitive race?
Well, I didn't really think so much about how many people were in the race. What I noticed about the other candidates is that there are a lot of really prestigious degrees, and I would say that there's a certain background that my opponents have that is very different from, I believe, the average voter and from me. So look, I was born and raised and educated in Maryland, and I'm proud of that. I've seen the very best and the very worst of what Maryland has to offer. And I believe that the voters in Maryland are going to care about that too. So we need someone who really knows Maryland, understands Maryland, and being the only candidate in this race with that background, I think it is very unique. The fact that there are 9 people, I mean, there were 10, we're now at 9. For me, it's not a factor in my decision. At the end of the day, my decision is really motivated by wanting to make a difference.
So as Anne Arundel County Executive, you were a Republican. What was the reason for becoming an independent and then ultimately a Democrat? Walk us through that process.
Sure. So I was actually raised a Democrat. My mother was a business partner of probably the most corrupt politician in Maryland history, certainly in Baltimore history. He went to federal prison 3 times. When I was a child, the FBI knocked on my front door because my mother was in this partnership for an interstate fraud scheme they created. So I grew up in corrupt Baltimore City politics. And that's all I knew. And in fact, it's the reason I never thought I would go into politics because, that was my history, watching my parents go through this and them thinking that, that was okay. That wasn't okay with me. And it wasn't really who I wanted to be. So when I left my home city of Baltimore and moved away, I was really turning my back on everything that I had known growing up. My goal was really to start a new life. And I believed that if I started over, I could be the person I wanted to be in the world instead of the people that my parents were. So part of that was changing parties. It wasn't really ideology based as much as it was, this is what I know. And now I want to be a different person in the world. And so I like the idea of a self-starter and working hard. That appeals to me because I'm a hard worker. But it wasn't so much about the ideologies of the parties as much as it was about a fresh start. So that's why I became a Republican. I did work in a Democratic administration. I've worked with Democrats and Republicans. It's not my nature to be partisan. I'm a problem solver. I believe in working together. I don't like partisan politics. But the reason I became a Democrat, very simply, is because while I'm still fiscally responsible and I believe in creating business and opportunity and economy, I don't think the government should have an active role in people's personal lives. And so those issues specifically are where, the Democratic Party better aligns with my belief system. I think you should be able to marry who you love, and women should ultimately make decisions for themselves about their bodies. And so those kinds of issues really prompted me to think long and hard about which party best aligned with my beliefs. And I do believe Maryland is more purple than blue, and that, being what we would call moderate, I guess, these days, is probably where most of the voters are. It's certainly where I am, and it's where a lot of the folks are that I'm talking to.
And what do you consider to be the critical issues of the campaign?
In the campaign, I think the real issue is, what do people really believe? And can you get them to be very specific about that? So, it's really great to talk about all the things that you want to do. And I want to do a lot of great things too, but we also need to talk about how we pay for those things, right? So how do we, if you're saying that there's a certain policy or agenda issue that you believe in and you support, then you need to be clear about the path to supporting that. I feel very strongly about accountability. Transparency is probably overused as a word, but I'm into radical transparency. Whenever anyone questioned the work that I did when I was in office, I picked up the phone and called them and explained to them what we were doing. Or if a reporter had a question about our revenue cap in the county, I invited them in to understand how the formula works and the work that we were doing. I made a commitment to never, ever push an issue aside and to deal with everything that came across my desk. That kind of accountability, I think, is so important on the campaign trail. It's really great to talk about all the wonderful things you want to do, but you need a practical plan to get there.
So I spent some time on your website reviewing, your sort of initial statements on the issues related to the economy, education, healthcare, housing, and civil rights. Can you give us sort of a snapshot of your how you're going to be addressing some of these issues that is distinctive from the other nine candidates?
Sure. Well, I just had a call with, a business group that, is very concerned because they feel like they've been singled out in the pandemic. And look, a lot of people don't understand that businesses take a lot of risk. You don't just start a business and become a millionaire. It's not really how it works. There's a process along the way. I had epic failure before I had, incredible success. So there is risk associated with the creation of business. I do believe in supporting and understanding the needs of the business community because our economy is what provides the tax structure for the lifestyle that we so enjoy. This idea that we should be demonizing them, I don't really support. I think we need to be partners with reasonable expectations. Now, when I say that, I'm talking about businesses in Maryland. I'm not talking about, the monster companies like Amazon and Microsoft. I'm talking about businesses in our community who are struggling to survive. So why do we keep Walmart and Wendy's open, but the mom and pop has to close down? I think there are real concerns about that. And, we need to be thoughtful in how we respond to that business community. Well, I also believe that we need to be compassionate. While we want to support business and see business be successful, we need to be compassionate when people need help. And so because I've lived everywhere on the socioeconomic spectrum, I know what it's like to struggle. I feel very strongly about kindness and compassion and understanding where people are. And sometimes we have an expectation that just can't be met because of where someone might be. And that caring and kindness, I just genuinely deeply care about seeing the potential and providing opportunity for everyone. And so that's really the balanced approach that I'll bring to governing. That's really what honestly motivates me every day to do this.
And how will you address the issue of polarity in governing Maryland?
I actually think having a Democratic governor who understands the importance of economy and business, working with a Democratic legislature is a great combination. Because right now what we have is, a governor who, is popular for pushing back and a legislature that, has their own specific agenda. And it's hard to find middle ground. And I think if we work together, we can find that middle ground. So that's really, I'm very hopeful about that. I've worked with Republicans and Democrats, and I just don't believe any issue is a zero-sum game. Every issue requires discussion, and you can find some common ground if you try to.
And what are your plans for addressing the challenges facing Baltimore City?
Well, as the only candidate born and raised and educated in Baltimore City, I feel very strongly about it. Now, I spent a lot of time in the DC suburbs of Prince George's and Montgomery. And I will say, in fairness to them, so much energy goes to Baltimore when they're working really hard to build their communities, and they've been very successful with that. But if we don't fix Baltimore, and if we don't have a good connection between the governor and Baltimore, I do think that Baltimore is not going to turn around. When I lived in Baltimore City, I'll just take one of the years, 1970, there were 1 million people in Baltimore City. We're down to 585,000. You can't turn on the news without seeing a negative headline about Baltimore City. We have a lot of people who are in elected office representing Baltimore City. It's time for Annapolis and Baltimore to work together to see real change. So look, when I see those news stories, I can tell you where that street is. If there's a murder in Baltimore City, there was a horrible, horrible murder reported last night. Someone who works in Little Italy was in his car walking out of a convenience store. I know exactly where that street is because I grew up in that city. So having that kind of knowledge, I'll call it insider knowledge of the city, I think is very helpful in discussing real change in the city. So for me, that is a top issue. It's a top priority item. And I'm really excited to have that background coming into the conversations about how to see real change there.
I know there are lots of other topics that we cover, but I want to close out by asking you, why should the citizens of Maryland elect Laura Neuman?
Well, first of all, I care. This is personal for me. I have been born and raised in this state. I care deeply about what's happening in this state. But on the credential side, I'd say, look, I bring public and private sector experience, and that's what we need right now. But beyond that, what matters most is that this is personal. I really want to be a great governor for Maryland. It matters to me. And I'm excited about what's ahead. And I believe I have the best experience to serve the state of Maryland.
Well, Laura, I want to wish you the best of luck on your campaign, and I look forward to seeing you on the governor's mansion, because in 1907, my great grandmother invited Mark Twain to the governor's mansion, and there's a famous photograph of Mark Twain with my great grandfather. So I can't wait to see you at the governor's mansion so we can replicate a photograph of you and me.
I was going to say, I can't wait to invite you.
So best of luck, Laura.
I hope I have that honor.
Thanks, Laura. I enjoyed the interview, and best of luck.
Thank you so much.